most of the characters that we grew up with in the 80s, and to some extent the 90s, all had signature weapons. They had something about them that let them funnel their aggression and their power through. And He-Man is probably one of the most definitive. Not only did he have a definitive arch-villain, but he had his accessory, which let him battle that villain. And while the villain and the hero have changed a lot over the years, there's been some core attributes that have not. Skeletor always has a skull face and tends to almost be wearing a purple hood. And He-Man is almost always a barbarian and is always wielding a sword. But the sword hasn't always stayed the same. Yes, it's his signature weapon, but as James Zimmerman asked in the comments section, what's up with the 2000X sword and why it was so different? Well, there is a reason for that, and it harkens back to the very beginning of the brand and the way the sword was represented in the content. It has changed over the years, and it's been different colors, and it's been many weird colors, and it's also been different forms and different shapes, but it's always been the source of He-Man's power, whether it's been a toy or a letter opener. When you see He-Man's sword, you know that he's going to lift it up and say, I have the power, and transform. That's why it works so well for a role-play item, because kids want to inherently be bigger and stronger, and the sword is what lets them do that. In fact, the He-Man sword has been the #1 role-play item for Mattel multiple years when they have a He-Man line. So how is it that the sword has changed design over the years, from what the original was, whether it's gotten darker or lighter in tone and manner? There's always been a sword, and it hasn't always stayed exactly the same. There's kind of a core version that we remember as kids, but there's been different versions and different content. So let's go back to the beginning, the very first representation of He-Man in Masters of the Universe. And here, He-Man doesn't even have a sword. In fact, Skeletor has the sword right there. And He-Man has an axe. That was actually He-Man's main weapon. When he was originally created, he was going to be an axe wielder, a axe and a shield, and a harness that was going to give him superpowers. This harness was going to give him a force field, and different harnesses and different accessories given to him by either the goddess or other characters were going to give him different powers, flight, invisibility, etc. But the axe was going to be his main aggressive weapon for battling evil, whether it was Skeletor or giant squid monsters. Whatever it was, you could just axe him a question. The sword, on the other hand, was the MacGuffin of the brand. It was designed to be the key to the castle. Everyone was trying to take over the castle, and if you combined both halves of the sword, you could create the full key. That was the original play pattern, and it did show up in a lot of the early mini-comics and some of the DC comics, but by the time Filmation came around, this concept was more or less dropped. But it did stick around in the toys. In fact, you can see He-Man and Skeletor as a toy each came with half of the power sword. The flat side would clip into each other. One had a male and one had a female hook. Skeletor had the female, He-Man had the male part, and when you would combine them together and snap them together, you could make the full sword, which literally would then be the key to open Castle Grayskull's drawbridge. In fact, you could insert it right into the castle, and that's how you open the door. Of course, you could use your finger or a Q-tip or pretty much anything, but that was the fantasy way. So you can see other characters like Faker, who had a sword. He had the Skeletor version with the slot, the female half, versus He-Man, which had the male half of the sword. And here is Skeletor using both halves to open up Castle Grayskull in the original storyline before Filmation changed it, turning the sword from a key to open the gates into the power of, or the source, if you will, of He-Man's transformation. Originally, whoever captured both swords, like here we have Skeletor, in the original mini-comics, successfully capturing both sides of the sword, and he now enters the castle. After the first few mini-comics, DC Comics was tapped to expand the story, and they made the Power Sword much more of He-Man's, I guess, origin, for lack of a better word. They created Prince Adam, very much similar to Superman and Clark Kent, where Prince Adam would hold the sword and say the magic words. Well, actually, in the DC comic, he went into a cave and changed into He-Man, much like Clark Kent went into a phone booth. I know kids are like, what's a phone booth? By the time Filmation came along, which was 2 years after the brand launched, He-Man was now raising his sword in the air and calling out the magic words, by the power of Grayskull, I have the power. And that is what started the transformation. Skeletor, while he did steal the sword, it wasn't for the same reason in the mini-comics to get into the castle. It was more to steal He-Man's sword, and, who doesn't want to steal He-Man's sword? The look of it was very steady, for lack of a better word. It didn't change in Filmation, and She-Ra's sword looked very similar, except it had a jewel in the center. We'll get into that in a whole other video. So the whole idea of two halves going together was more or less dropped, but you can see the general look of the way the blade was with the two side pieces was consistent. All of this changed, however, in the 2000X series, or what's also called the Mike Young production series, which was the 2001-2002 animated series and toy line Mattel put out as part of a relaunch of the brand for a quote-unquote new generation of kids. It did have a huge collector following and didn't quite become the hit with kids that Mattel hoped it would. A big reason for the collector appeal was these guys, the Four Horsemen, who sculpted the characters. Now, the original pitch the Horsemen made for relaunching the brand was different from what Mike Young Productions did. They redesigned He-Man, not just from a look point of view, but they looked at their redesign as a sequel to Filmation. They wanted to continue the story. Now, Mattel and Mike Young instead looked at the increased earning potential if they sort of threw out the old storyline and started over. And they saw it as a much better route to getting a new generation into the brand. So they hit the reboot button instead of continuing with the Horsemen's original storyline. But a lot of the visual elements that the Horsemen created for their sequel storyline remained in place and were just incorporated into Mike Young. So let's go into those a little bit. It's a very interesting story. So as noted earlier, the sword started off in the original mini-comics as two halves when combined became a key to enter the castle. The Horsemen really wanted to bring this concept back in their proposed sequel line. So their idea was that Skeletor had captured both sides of the sword. And that's why the Skeletor figure in 2002 comes with two halves of a sword that combine. And you could see one half is the light side and one is kind of the dark side. You had the purple one Skeletor had and the bronze silver one that He-Man would have had. So it's really just an update, and you can even see visually it has the same curved handle that the original 82 figures came with. So the swords that Skeletor is wielding in the 2000X series, as designed by the Horsemen, was supposed to be both halves of the power sword now combined. So Skeletor had the sword. We tried to kind of do an homage to this with the Keldor figure from the Classics line, where we did both halves of the sword in purple. And fans weren't too happy with that. They really wanted a proper 2000X sword, so we later actually did that in plastic form as a offering in one of the weapon packs. Of course, there was a factory error, and the factory didn't realize we wanted the sword to split in two, and they sealed it as one piece. So the units they sealed in one piece, which was something like 100 or 500 units, we polybagged and gave out at PowerCon, the He-Man convention, a way to make lemons out of lemonade, and then told the factory for the remainder of the run it's supposed to break up into two pieces. So it was fixed for the weapons pack. But hey, that way you got a cool special version at PowerCon because of a factory error. So what about He-Man's sword in 2000X? So because the Horsemen designed pitched a storyline that was a sequel where Skeletor obtained He-Man's sword, it was now going to be up to Man-at-Arms to find a way to help Adam transform into He-Man. And he was going to do that now with an artificial sword. So instead of having the magical sword that could harmonize with the power of Grayskull and transform Adam, Man-at-Arms designed a techno sword, if you will, that could do the same thing but do it electronically. So where the first sword was a mystic sword that, think of it like a wireless connection where it mystically, magically connects with the orb inside Castle Grayskull that powers He-Man. This is the orb in toy form that we did in the Classics line. So this magical orb could harmonize with the sword, think of it again like wireless connection, and transform Adam into He-Man. Well, now that He-Man no longer had his sword, Man-at-Arms had to build one for him, and so built him a technical one, a robotic one, a mechanical sword, which could do the same type of Wi-Fi connection to the magical orb, but do so less in a mystic way and more in a technological way, And that's why Man-at-Arms in Classics came with the sword, because he built it. He was supposed to have built it for Adam after the original was stolen by Skeletor, both halves. And now this was going to be a way that Adam could retain his powers and become He-Man even without access to the original sword. When this concept was thrown out and Mike Young and Mattel decided to just reboot the series, well, they kept the sword design. And hey, now the sword was also going to give He-Man new powers, because, getting new powers is cool. So the sword was visually going to do this by being able to transform. And of course, this was a way to sell more toys as well. In the second season, when He-Man needs new armor to fight new villains, in this case the Snake Men, when King Hiss has returned, the sword is able to split down the middle, if you will, and show an inner core, and transform He-Man and give him new types of armor and new types of weapons, and essentially build armor around him. Honestly, it was a great excuse to come out with more toys. When He-Man went into the Arctic wastes, he could create ice armor that could allow him to stay warm or, travel in the snow. And this version showed up on the show and showed up on shelf. It's actually what's called show to shelf. It's an expression in the toy industry when a figure is done representing exactly what the character looks like in the show, whether it's their main outfit or a secondary outfit, like the ice armor one. I was actually a big fan of this armor, especially because it did show up on the show. It was one of the few variants from 2000X that actually did show up on the show and in the toy aisle. Most of the variants were just done as toys. Maybe they would have shown up in the show eventually, had it not been canceled before its time. So with this concept established in the 2000X series, that the sword could now provide He-Man with new armor and could change form, like here's the ice version of the sword there, well, in Classics, we decided to take this concept that was now established and, well...
Now picture that, but everywhere.
So the sword's new ability from 2000X to create new armor and to change form could be universally applied, both retro and forward, or retconned and forward thinking, to all the different versions of He-Man's armor and the way the sword did change throughout the series. Some of the later vintage figures, like the laser figure of He-Man, had a very different looking sword. Granted, it was supposed to kind of tie into the movie, but by the time we got to New Adventures, the sword did look very different. The handle was different, the blade was different, and while there were some similarities to the original version, both the Alcala version from the mini-comics and Filmation, it did have a unique look. And the idea was that now that it was established that the sword could change shape, change color, and generate new armor, well, this was going to be a sort of Deus Ex Machina of why, when He-Man had to face new villains like space mutants in outer space with cake, well, he could now use the sword, much like he did in the 2000X series, to change his armor and the look of the sword, if need be. So, when the Power Sword looked like this, instead of looking like Filmation, you now had an in-story explanation that was grounded in what it did in the 2000X series. Classics was always envisioned as a sequel to 2000X. As for why it changed color, well, same thing. Much like it could change form, it made sense it would be able to change color. And the reason that the sword was issued in many different colors in Classics wasn't just because it was fun and we were paying homage to different colored versions of it over the years, but the idea was when Prince Adam held the sword, well, if he just had the silver sword, people would recognize it as He-Man's. So it made sense that it would camouflage itself and turn a different color. So when Prince Adam held it, it would be pinkish in color. When Skeletor held it, it would transform from silver to purple. And this was sort of a universal thing that whoever picked it up, it would change color based on the wielder. So when Faker picked up the sword, it would be orange. When He-Man had it, it would be silver. And different characters like Wundar and Vicor, who were also wielders of the Sword of He being the Trollan word for power, as I explained in a few other videos. So this blue sword that came in the vintage weapon pack which was going to be Vicor's version, or rather the sword when held by Vicor would simply just turn blue, because that was the color it was when Vicor had it. Plus, it was a great way to sell more toys, sell more letter openers, and all sorts of things, because, hey, when you had an established reason why the sword could change color in the storyline, and it was established in the content, all the better. Now, the newest version of Masters of the Universe coming to Netflix brings the first one, at least, the Kevin Smith one, which is a sequel. I guess the sequel the Horsemen originally wanted to do is now actually being done. Well, it's not the Horsemen sequel, but the concept of doing a sequel. And then there's the CGI version for kids on Netflix. This one features a very different looking sword that is actually a little bit more like 2000X. Will it turn out to be something constructed by Man-at-Arms, like the Four Horsemen imagine? I mean, we've got two very different power swords on two very different shows coming to Netflix, and I guess time will tell how the swords work and why they look the way they do. I do think Mattel is doing a great job making the figure appeal to kids, and that's what's so important, because without kids behind the line, it's really hard to sell at retail. Collectors are usually not enough to support a line, so while collectors do have a line aimed at them, hopefully kids will fall in love with it too, and both series and all versions of the sword from here and to infinity and beyond will continue to inspire children around the world. And be cool for collectors too. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments. Always answer them and pass this video to others. It helps tell YouTube to do that too. Thanks for watching.